In the winter of 1883, a man heard a sound in the snow that no rancher could ignore. The muffled cry of a woman chained like an animal. The winter of 1883 was merciless. Snow had buried the Texas frontier beneath a white shroud, and the wind carved through the ridges like a knife. Elias Boone had been working the fence line since dawn, his breath rising in ragged clouds, his gloved hands raw from wire and frost. He was a man who had long since accepted solitude, carving a life out of silence and cattle, speaking to no one but the land itself. But on that bitter morning, a sound cut through the stillness. Faint, muffled, not quite a scream, but enough to freeze him in place. It wasn't the cry of cattle, it wasn't the bark of coyotes. It was human, and it carried pain. Elias's jaw locked tight. He let the coil of barbed wire slip from his grip, the metal striking the snow with a hollow clatter. He swung into the saddle, his horse shifting beneath him, nostrils flaring against the cold. He didn't rush. Men who rushed often ended up dead. He rode steady, the wind howling across the ridge until the trail opened near a stand of pines. That's where he saw them. A wagon sat crooked in the snow, its wheels half buried in frost. Two men loitered beside it, one watering horses, the other crouched by the rear wheel. And then he saw her. A woman, on her knees, chained through the iron spoke like a beast. Her dress, what remained of it, was nothing but torn buckskin, slashed across the shoulder, the neckline ripped open. Her skin was marked with bruises, her arms trembling as she tried to hold herself upright in the snow. Her dark hair, tangled and matted with feathers and scraps of leather, fell across her face. She wasn't crying, not loud. She was holding it back, as though she had learned long ago that crying never bought mercy. Elias dismounted. Slow, deliberate. His boots sank into the snow. The older man glanced up, eyes narrowing. "Something you need, stranger?" Elias's pale blue gaze stayed locked on the woman. He didn't answer. He didn't have to. The air itself seemed to tighten, as though every breath, every heartbeat, was waiting to see what kind of man he truly was. Elias Boone didn't answer the man's question. His boots crunched against the hard snow as he stepped closer, pale blue eyes never leaving the figure on the ground. The older of the two strangers stood, belly protruding under a filthy coat, his expression shifting between curiosity and challenge. The younger one smirked nervously, his thin hands fidgeting at his belt, like he wanted to appear dangerous but couldn't quite convince even himself. The woman remained still, her head bowed. A tremor ran through her shoulders, whether from cold or fear Elias couldn't tell. What mattered was that she didn't look at him, didn't dare. That alone told him everything he needed to know about the kind of hell she'd been dragged through. "I asked you a question," the older man barked, stepping forward, boots sinking into the icy trail. "What business you got staring at another man's property?" The word property lit something sharp behind Elias's ribs. He didn't flinch. Instead, he reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a worn leather pouch. He tossed it into the snow between them. Bills spilled free, scattering in the wind. "I'll take her," Elias said, his voice flat, final. The younger man laughed harshly, as if he hadn't heard right. "You'll what?" "You heard me." Elias's tone didn't change. "Unchain her. Now." The older man eyed the money, suspicion tugging at the corners of his mouth, but greed was stronger than pride. He gave a sharp nod to his companion. "Do it." The younger man bent down, fumbling with the lock. Elias knelt in the snow, but not too close. He wanted her to see his hands, empty and steady. She flinched anyway, her breath catching when the chain clattered loose. He slipped out of his duster coat and laid it beside her. No words, no touch, just an offering. Slowly, painfully, her eyes lifted. Glassy, bruised, filled with something between exhaustion and defiance. She stared at him, trying to measure him. Not as a savior, but as another man who might demand something in return. "Take it," he said quietly. Her fingers, raw and reddened, reached out. She clutched the coat tight around her shoulders. Elias stood, offered his hand. She hesitated only a heartbeat before taking it. Her skin was ice, but her grip was steady. He pulled her to her feet, helped her onto the horse, and mounted ahead of her. She winced as she settled behind him, her arms circling his waist just enough to stay upright. Elias didn't look back at the men. He didn't need to. His silence was enough of a warning. The ride home was long and bitter. Snow slashed at their faces, the wind cutting through the pines like shards of glass. Every so often, he felt her shiver against him. But she didn't cry. Not once. By the time they reached the cabin, Izrenia, нощта започна да се мърда по хоризонта. Elias dismounted first, then helped her down. She nearly collapsed, knees buckling, but caught herself with stubborn strength. He opened the cabin door and let her step inside first. The room was plain. A small hearth glowing with low embers, a wooden table, a bed against the far wall. No frills, no luxury, just survival. She stood stiffly near the fire, still wrapped in his coat, her arms tight against her chest. Elias moved quietly, setting fresh logs in the hearth until flames licked high and warm. He filled a pot with water, placed it over the coals, then fetched a wool blanket and laid it gently on the bed. "You can sit," he said, voice low. "You're safe here." Her head turned slowly. Her lips were cracked, her jaw clenched, but she managed to whisper, "Why?" Elias stared into the fire before answering. "Because I could. Because no one else was going to." Silence stretched between them, fragile but alive. She lowered herself to the edge of the bed, the coat slipping from one shoulder. Bruises marred her skin. She pulled the blanket close, hiding them as if ashamed. Minutes passed before Elias placed a bowl of stew on the table. He didn't press her to eat, just left it there. Then he stepped outside, letting the night air sting his lungs. Inside, she was alone, but not in danger. For the first time in who knew how long. When he returned, she hadn't touched the food. She was still wrapped in the blanket, eyes wide open, watching the fire like it might disappear. He set a folded shirt and trousers on the table. "They'll be big," he said quietly, "but they're clean." Her gaze flicked to the clothes, then to him. His eyes never wavered from her face. Not her body. Not the scars. Just her. For the first time, she breathed easier. Later, when she changed, he gave her privacy. She emerged in the oversized clothes, the blanket draped across her shoulders. The cabin felt less like a prison, more like a place to rest. She sat straighter, her eyes steadier. The stew bowl was finally empty. That night, Elias spread a second blanket near the hearth. He didn't take the bed, didn't offer it. He simply lay down on the hard floor as if it were the most natural thing in the world. She watched him from the mattress, not confused, not afraid, just quietly stunned. "You'll sleep there?" she asked softly. "I do tonight," he replied. She said nothing more. But when she finally laid her head down, she closed her eyes in a place where no one was waiting to hurt her. The wind howled outside, but for one night, in one cabin, silence meant safety. The fire had burned down to a low orange glow, shadows moving long across the cabin walls. Outside, the storm clawed at the roof, rattling loose boards like fingers on a coffin lid. Inside, there was silence, but not the hollow silence Elias Boone had grown used to over the years. This was different. It was the silence of two people sharing the same space without knowing what tomorrow might demand. Ayana lay curled on the edge of the bed, wrapped in his wool blanket. Her breathing was shallow but steady, like a creature that had finally found cover yet still expected the trap to spring. Elias, stretched on the floor near the hearth, didn't sleep. He lay with his arms folded across his chest, staring into the beams above. He could hear the wind outside, the groan of ice shifting in the trees. But what stayed with him most was the faint rustle from the bed whenever she stirred in her uneasy rest. At dawn, he rose quietly and set wood on the coals until the fire cracked back to life. He brewed coffee, reheated beans in a skillet, the bitter smell filling the cabin. Ayana sat up slowly, eyes scanning the room as though checking for danger. There was none. Just him, moving with the same quiet, deliberate rhythm as the night before. "Coffee," he said simply, sliding a tin cup toward her. She hesitated, then wrapped her hands around the metal. Her fingers trembled slightly from the heat, But she drank. He didn't watch her. He never stared. That, more than the coffee, seemed to steady her. After a while, her voice broke the quiet, cracked but direct. Why did you do it? He set the skillet aside, wiped his hands on a rag. Because I could. Because I've seen what happens when no one steps in. Her eyes lingered on him, searching for lies, finding none. Still, her jaw clenched tight as if the words she carried weighed too much. Finally, she spoke, each word dragging out of her like stone from the earth. They passed me from man to man, weeks, months. She stopped, shook her head. I don't even know anymore. I was told I'd be worth more if I stayed quiet. That men didn't want women who spoke. Elias didn't move, didn't even shift his eyes. But his hand tightened faintly around the rag, knuckles white. They said my body was worth more than my words. The fire popped loudly in the silence that followed. Elias's voice was low, steady, dangerous in its restraint. They were wrong. Her lips parted, but no words came. She just stared at him, as though trying to believe someone could say it and mean it. She lowered her gaze, her fingers twisting the edge of the blanket. They call me Ayana, she whispered. I don't know if that name is still mine. Elias's reply came without hesitation. It's yours. No one can take it. She looked back at him, searching again. This time there was something softer in her eyes. Not trust, not yet, but something close. The day passed in heavy quiet. Elias worked outside, checking the cattle pens, mending fence boards stiff with ice. Ayana stayed near the hearth, sewing a torn seam on the coat he'd given her, her hands clumsy at first but steadier as the hours stretched on. Every time the door opened and he stepped back inside, she straightened, her body tense. By evening, the tension had dulled. Not gone, but muted, like an ache that was no longer raw. That night, after stew and silence, Ayana finally asked, You live alone. For how long? 5 winters, Elias said. No wife? No children? He shook his head. Thought about it once, before the war, but the war took most of it. Took my brother in Tennessee. Took my parents the same winter. I came back to a house with no one left in it. So I built a new one. Out here, quiet. Fence posts, cattle. Things that didn't ask more than I could give. Ayana's eyes didn't leave him. She understood emptiness. She carried her own. After a long pause, Elias asked softly, You? Her voice was flat, stripped of ornament. When I was 16, a man in my tribe took me. My parents couldn't stop it. He died in a raid. I didn't mourn him. She swallowed hard. After that, I lived with my uncle's family. Until the raids came again, they killed him, took me. The words hung heavy, like smoke that couldn't clear. Elias didn't answer. He didn't offer pity, didn't tell her he was sorry. He simply sat there, shoulders rigid, eyes steady, as if holding the weight with her. Finally, Ayana asked, You think people like us can start over? Elias leaned back in his chair, arms folded. Some people don't get the choice. But if you do, if it's handed to you, you take it, even if it's small. She turned toward the window. Snow was still falling, coating the land in white silence. Inside, though, the warmth held steady. Later, as Elias mended a bridle strap near the door, Ayana ran her fingers over the patched seams of her old buckskin dress. She had stitched it carefully, piece by piece. When she caught him watching, she said calmly, I don't want to sleep in your bed. He looked up, startled. Not because I don't trust you, she added quickly, but because it feels like it belongs to someone else, a woman you never had. Or maybe the man you were before. Elias nodded slowly, understanding. It's just a bed. Not to me. He met her gaze and something passed between them. An understanding that went deeper than the firelight. You can have the floor, he said. I'll take the fire. No, she answered. You already gave me your home. I'll take the floor. They didn't argue. The decision itself was enough. That night, she laid her blanket near the window, close enough to feel the fire but far enough to breathe on her own terms. Elias stretched out on the bed, eyes fixed on the ceiling beams, the silence between them no longer brittle, but alive. The storm outside raged on, but inside the cabin for the first time, choice had entered the room. And that choice, her choice, was everything. The storm broke 3 days later, leaving the land glazed in white silence. Snow hardened into ice, rivers froze stiff, and the hills carried a sharp, frozen sheen. Elias worked long hours repairing the south gate, while Ayanna carried wood and swept the cabin, her movements less hesitant now, more deliberate. She had begun to fill the space not as a guest, not as a captive, but as someone carving a corner of belonging. But the outside world never stayed away forever. One evening, as the fire burned low, Elias spoke. His voice was quiet but weighted. "I'll need to ride into town tomorrow. We're low on flour, salt, kerosene." Ayanna froze, spoon hovering above her bowl. Her dark eyes flicked to his face, searching for any trace of expectation. "I won't make you come," Elias said, steady as stone. "It's your choice." Her throat tightened. She stared at the fire, where sparks cracked and spit, her voice barely above a whisper. "If I go, they'll know." "They might," Elias admitted, "but I'll be there." The silence stretched long between them. Outside, wind rattled against the shutters. Inside, Ayanna's heart pounded like a drum. She had lived too long under stares, hungry, judging, cruel. Could she face them again? Yet something in the way Elias said, "I'll be there," not commanding, not pleading, just certain, made her nod. "I'll go." Morning came sharp and bitter. The wagon creaked as Elias hitched the team. Ayanna emerged wearing the patched deer-hide dress beneath a brown shawl she'd sewn from an old blanket. Her hair was braided back, feathers woven in with careful precision. She didn't wear a bonnet. She wouldn't hide. Elias offered his arm as they climbed into the wagon. She hesitated, then rested her hand lightly on his sleeve. He didn't move, didn't glance at her, but his shoulders squared as though that single touch steadied him too. The ride to town was silent. Snow crunched beneath the wheels, the sky a dull gray pressing low against the land. Ayanna sat tall beside him, her jaw set, her fingers white-knuckled around the edge of her shawl. By the time they reached the main street, heads were already turning. Men paused in doorways. Women froze mid-step. Conversations cut short. Whispered voices trailed after them like smoke. Elias drove straight, his gaze fixed forward. At the general store, he dismounted, then turned and offered his hand. Ayanna's chest tightened. For a heartbeat, she considered staying seated, letting the wagon shield her. But something deeper, something stubborn, rose inside her. She took his hand. The store went quiet the moment they stepped inside. The owner, a stout man with gray whiskers, froze mid-count behind the counter. His eyes darted from Ayanna's face to Elias's steady hand at her back. "We'll need salt, sugar, cornmeal, kerosene," Elias said calmly. "And 2 yards of cotton cloth. She's planting the garden this spring." The man hesitated, his jaw twitching as though he might argue. But Elias's tone left no room. Slowly, the shopkeeper began to gather supplies. Ayanna stood tall, her fingers brushing lightly against Elias's arm. She felt the eyes on her, slicing, judging, remembering. She didn't look away. She would not bow her head. When they stepped back into the street, a man near the blacksmith muttered low. Elias stopped, turned. "You say something?" His voice was calm but steel laced through it. The man shifted, smirked nervously, then shook his head. "Didn't say a thing." Elias's silence held longer than words. The man looked away. Ayanna's pulse thundered in her ears as they climbed back into the wagon. She waited for her hands to shake, for the familiar panic to rise. But it didn't. Not this time. The ride home was quiet. Snow drifted soft across the hills. She held the bolt of cotton cloth in her lap, fingers pressed against it as though it were something sacred. At the cabin, as Elias unloaded supplies, Ayanna lingered on the porch, staring back down the trail they had taken. Her chest rose and fell hard, breath clouding in the cold. I didn't think I could do it, she said finally, her voice raw. Face them. Hear them. Elias paused, turned. His pale eyes caught hers. You weren't alone. The words struck deeper than she expected. Her throat tightened. For so long she had faced everything, chains, fists, stares, alone. Now, she realized, she hadn't. Inside, she placed the cloth on the table, smoothing it carefully. Her hands shook. Not from fear, but from something new. Purpose. That night, as the fire burned low, Elias sharpened his knife at the table while Ayanna sewed long stitches into the cotton, her movements slow but steady. The silence between them wasn't fragile anymore. It was strong, heavy with what had passed between them in town. And yet, under the weight of that silence, a question lingered. Not spoken. Not yet. But it was there, pulsing beneath every glance, every brush of fingers. Could this fragile piece survive the world beyond the cabin walls? The days after their return from town were quieter, but never simple. Something had shifted. Ayanna moved differently through the cabin, her shoulders straighter, her eyes steadier. She had walked into the lion's den and lived, yet the weight of it clung to her like smoke, those whispers, those stares. At night she lay awake, staring at the rafters, her mind chasing shadows she thought she'd buried. Elias felt it too. He didn't speak on it, but he saw the tension in her jaw, the way her fingers paused when she threaded a needle or pressed herbs into the pot. It was as if she was waiting for the world to claw back what little she'd gained. One afternoon, she stepped outside to tend the small plot of earth near the cabin. The snow was gone now, replaced by damp soil and the smell of thaw. She knelt in the dirt, pressing seeds into rows, her hands darkened with earth. Elias watched from the porch, arms folded across his chest. She looked as though she belonged there, yet her eyes were far away. "What are you thinking?" he asked. Her voice was quiet, but it carried. That the ground doesn't care who plants it. It only asks that you stay long enough to see things grow. Elias nodded. He understood, but her words carried more than planting. They carried a choice. That night, as the fire cast its glow across the cabin walls, Ayanna laid her repaired deerskin dress on the table. She had mended it stitch by stitch, reclaiming it from ruin. Now, clean and strong, it was no longer a reminder of captivity but of survival. "I kept it," she said, "not because I need to wear it, but because I won't forget where I came from." Elias set down the knife he'd been sharpening. His eyes stayed on the dress, then lifted to her. "It's part of you, but it doesn't own you." She looked at him steadily. "And if I choose to stay here, what will I be to you? Someone you rescued? Or someone you'll claim?" The air thickened between them, fire popping softly in the silence. Elias leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "You'll be what you choose to be, not mine, not anyone's. But if you wanted, you'd have a place here, beside me, not behind." Her breath hitched, not from fear but from the weight of his words. For the first time, she felt the full depth of what he was offering. Not shelter, not pity, but a life built on her choice. The test came sooner than either expected. 3 nights later, hoofbeats thundered down the trail. Elias had been mending tack inside when the sound froze him mid-motion. He set the leather down, hand already reaching for the rifle propped behind the stove. Ayanna stiffened, eyes wide. "Them?" she whispered. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. Both of them knew the past had long arms. A fist hammered against the cabin door. "Boone, we know you got her. That Apache ain't yours to keep. Step aside and maybe you walk away breathing." Elias's jaw clenched. He motioned Ayanna toward the corner, his pale eyes burning with resolve. He opened the door slowly, rifle cradled but steady. 3 men sat mounted in the snow, shadows sharp in the moonlight. Their faces were the kind he'd seen before, hard, greedy, the type that carved coin out of flesh. "She's not yours," Elias said. His voice was flat, carrying like steel across the cold. One man spat into the snow. "She ain't yours either. She's property. Ours. From inside, Ayanna stepped forward. Her heart pounded, but her voice carried, fierce and clear. I am not property. The words cracked the night like a gunshot. The men shifted, startled that she spoke at all. Elias didn't flinch. He raised the rifle, sight fixed steady. You heard her, he said. For a moment, the world held its breath. Snow whispered down from the pines. Hooves stamped restless against the frozen ground. Then the men cursed, turned their horses, and rode off into the night, the sound of retreat fading into the dark. Elias closed the door, bolted it. His chest heaved, not from fear but from the sharp rush of holding the line. Ayanna stood near the fire, trembling. Not from terror, but from release. She had spoken. She had defied them. And the world hadn't ended. Later, as dawn broke soft across the valley, Ayanna sat on the porch, wrapped in a shawl. Elias joined her, lowering himself onto the step. They didn't speak for a while. The land stretched wide and quiet, the creek running with melted snow, the fields waiting to bloom. Finally, she turned to him. If I stay, it won't be as someone you saved. It will be because I chose it. Elias looked at her, his pale eyes steady. Then stay, as my equal, as my wife, if that's what you want. She inhaled slowly, the cold air burning her lungs. She thought of the chains, the whispers, the years stolen. Then she thought of the cabin, the soil beneath her hands, the man who had never once taken what wasn't freely given. Her hand slipped into his. Strong. Certain. Then I choose. And in that moment, against the silence of the frontier, against the weight of history, Ayanna was no longer a woman passed between hands. She was a woman who chose where she stood and with whom she would build. The fire inside the cabin flickered low, but in the heart of the Texas wilderness, something new had been lit. A beginning.